Tonight, we're revisiting three cases that once shocked entire communities and then slowly faded into the background of history. 3 young lives, 3 investigations, 3 files that closed but never truly settled. Celestina Sommer. In mid-19th century England, reputation was not simply a matter of character. It was a form of currency, earned slowly, guarded carefully, and capable of shaping a life long before any wrongdoing was imagined. Celestina Summer emerged into this world under circumstances that, by all outward appearances, suggested stability and promise. Born into a family that valued education and discipline, her early years were marked by structure rather than disorder. Contemporary accounts describe a childhood shaped by routine, instruction, and expectation, conditions that were often viewed as safeguards against moral failure. From a young age, Summer demonstrated notable musical ability. This talent was not treated as a novelty, but cultivated seriously. Formal training followed, placing her within educated social circles where refinement, restraint, and presentation were closely observed. Music, particularly for women of her standing, was both an accomplishment and a signal, evidence of cultivation and respectability, rather than ambition. As she entered adulthood, these qualities became central to her public identity. She was regarded as composed, articulate, and disciplined. Those who encountered her socially or professionally noted nothing erratic or concerning. She moved comfortably within environments that prized decorum, and there is no record from this period suggesting impropriety or instability. Within her community, Summer's name carried no stigma. She was not known for scandal, nor for excess. Instead, she was perceived as capable and reliable, someone whose conduct aligned with prevailing expectations of respectability. Her standing was not extraordinary, but it was secure. At this stage, there was nothing in her outward life to suggest the events that would later draw her into public scrutiny. What existed instead was a carefully constructed normalcy, a life defined, at least on the surface, by discipline, talent, and promise. By the time Celestina Summer reached adulthood, she was living with a degree of independence that reflected her education and abilities. She supported herself through her work, moved within respectable circles, and maintained the outward stability expected of a woman in her position. Nothing in her public conduct suggested deviation from social norms. It was during this period, however, that her private life diverged from the image she presented. Records later confirmed that Summer became involved in a relationship that resulted in pregnancy. The identity of the child's father was not publicly acknowledged, a silence that mirrored the conventions of the time rather than an anomaly. In mid-19th century England, an unmarried pregnancy carried consequences that extended far beyond personal circumstance. It threatened reputation, employability, and social survival. Faced with these realities, Summer acted in a manner that was neither unusual nor openly discussed. Rather than disclose the situation, she sought to manage it discreetly. Contemporary accounts indicate that the child was placed outside the immediate household under what were described as private arrangements, an informal system commonly used to conceal illegitimacy while preserving outward respectability. Such arrangements were not regulated in any meaningful way. They relied on trust, distance, and silence, offering practical solutions without resolution. For women, especially those dependent on reputation, they provided a means of maintaining social standing while postponing consequences rather than eliminating them. There is no indication that Summer attempted to draw attention to this situation, nor that those around her were aware of it at the time. Publicly, her life continued unchanged. Privately, a fracture had formed, managed carefully, spoken of rarely and never fully addressed. What appeared settled on paper and in practice remained unresolved beneath the surface. The arrangement succeeded in preserving appearances, but it did not erase the underlying reality. It merely delayed its return. Marriage marked a decisive turning point in the outward narrative of Celestina Summer's life. Contemporary records note that her union was conducted in accordance with social expectations of the period, providing a legitimate domestic framework that reinforced her standing within the community. For women in mid-19th century England, marriage functioned not only as a personal milestone, but as a form of social recalibration, one that could stabilize reputation and quiet earlier uncertainties. Following the marriage, a new household was established. The residence was modest but respectable, consistent with the couple's means and social position. Daily life assumed a predictable structure, shaped by routine, responsibility, and appearances carefully maintained. The household was not isolated. It operated within the rhythms of the surrounding neighborhood, neither conspicuous nor withdrawn. Domestic help was employed, a common practice that further signaled order and propriety. The presence of a maid reinforced the impression of stability, providing both practical assistance and an external witness to the household's normalcy. Nothing in these arrangements suggested conflict or disorder. On the contrary, the home appeared to function as expected, adhering to the quiet standards of respectability valued at the time. To neighbors and acquaintances, there was little to remark upon. No complaints were lodged, no disturbances recorded. The couple was perceived as settled, their domestic life unremarkable in the most reassuring sense. Any past complications remained firmly out of view, buried beneath the structure marriage provided. In this phase, the earlier ruse, mature seemed contained, appearances held. The household presented itself as orderly and secure, a domestic life aligned with social expectations and free, at least outwardly, from suspicion. It was a stability that existed convincingly, but only at the surface. In the days leading up to the incident, life inside the household of Celestina Summer followed a pattern that, on its face, appeared ordinary. Mornings began with routine domestic tasks. Meals were prepared. The home was kept in order. To an outside observer, nothing distinguished these days from those that had come before. It was during this period that the child was present within the house. The circumstances of the child's return were not publicly discussed at the time, nor did they immediately draw attention from neighbors. Within the household, however, the presence introduced a subtle shift, one that was later described not through accusation, but observation. The maid employed in the home continued her duties as usual, moving through familiar rooms and completing expected tasks. In later testimony, she would note small changes in routine. Doors kept closed more often than before, movements within the house that occurred at unusual hours, and a general sense that certain matters were being kept deliberately contained. These details were not alarming in isolation. They were mentioned only because they departed slightly from what had previously been normal. No disturbances were reported. No complaints were made to authorities. At the time, there was no reason to suspect that anything within the household had crossed beyond private difficulty into something more serious. The observations recorded later were restrained, factual, and notably absent of interpretation. What emerged from these accounts was not a portrait of chaos or conflict, but one of quiet tension, an atmosphere shaped by routine that continued as hers, uninterrupted, even as underlying circumstances shifted. To those inside the house, nothing appeared openly wrong. Yet, as later records would show, there was an unease present that never found expression until it was too late. The pivotal disturbance did not announce itself dramatically. It entered the record later through recollection, described calmly and without embellishment by the maid employed in the household of Celestina Sommer. During the night, while the rest of the house lay quiet, the maid recalled being aware of movement below. There were sounds, footsteps, the opening and closing of doors, activity at an hour when the household was ordinarily still. Nothing was loud enough to provoke immediate alarm, nor distinct enough to suggest an emergency. In a house where routine had recently shifted, such sounds did not initially appear extraordinary. The maid did not investigate. There was no cry for help, no clear indication of distress, and no instruction to intervene. As was common in domestic service at the time, boundaries were observed. Matters that appeared private were left undisturbed, particularly during the night. By morning, the household resumed its routine. Tasks were carried out as expected. Meals were prepared. The night's events were not mentioned, questioned, or acknowledged. There was no visible disruption to the order of the home, and no immediate reason to suspect that what had been heard carried any significance beyond ordinary movement. It was only in hindsight that these sounds acquired weight. When recounted later, they were presented without interpretation, simply as they had been experienced. The absence of reaction at the time was not framed as negligence, but as normal behavior within a household where nothing had yet declared itself as wrong. What remained from that night was not a clear warning, but a quiet unease, registered, then set aside, and never spoken aloud until the house itself revealed what the sounds had preceded. The following morning, the routine of the household began as it always had. Domestic tasks were underway, and the house was gradually opened room by room. It was during this ordinary process that attention turned toward the lower part of the property. Access to the cellar was not unusual. It formed part of the house's storage space and was entered only when necessary. On this occasion, the descent was prompted by the simple need to check the area below. There was no expectation of finding anything out of the ordinary. Upon entering the cellar, the situation changed immediately. The child was found there, unresponsive. The condition in which the child was discovered left no doubt that something had gone gravely wrong. The discovery did not unfold dramatically. It was sudden, quiet, and unmistakable. What followed was direct and procedural. The discovery was reported without delay. There was no attempt to conceal what had been found, nor to manage the situation privately. The boundaries of domestic discretion ended at that moment. Authorities were notified, and the property was effectively removed from the control of those who lived there. The house, which until then had functioned as a private space governed by routine and silence, became a site of official interest. The cellar, once an unremarkable part of the home, became central to the unfolding investigation. From this point forward, events progressed according to established process rather than personal decision. Responsibility passed from the household to the state. What had been contained within the walls of the home was now subject to examination, documentation, and record. With the notification of authorities, the matter ceased to be private. The situation entered the formal system through which such cases were handled, and the quiet arrangements that had defined the household's earlier handling of difficulty were replaced by scrutiny that could not be deferred. Officers responded promptly following the report, marking the formal beginning of the investigation into the death discovered at the residence of Celestina Sommer. Their arrival shifted the atmosphere of the house from private order to official procedure. The initial examination of the scene was conducted methodically. Attention was focused first on the cellar, where the child had been found. The space was inspected as it stood, with officers noting the position of the body and the surrounding conditions. Nothing was disturbed until observations were recorded, consistent with standard practice of the period. Items within the cellar were identified and documented. Objects considered relevant were removed for further examination, while others were left in place. The process was deliberate rather than hurried, reflecting the seriousness with which such cases were handled once they entered police jurisdiction. Statements were then taken from those present in the household. Each account was recorded separately. These early statements did not involve accusation or conjecture. They were limited to what each individual could attest to directly: movements, routines, and observations from the preceding days and night. The maid's account of sounds heard during the night was included at this stage, described without interpretation. Once preliminary documentation was complete, the child's body was formally removed from the property. From that moment, the matter moved beyond the confines of the household entirely. Medical examination and legal review would follow under official supervision. With the arrival of police, the case transitioned fully into the public sphere. What had begun as a discovery within a private residence was now a matter of record, entered into reports, logs, and documents that would define every step that followed. The death was next examined through a coroner's inquest, the formal mechanism by which such cases were assessed before criminal proceedings could advance. Convened according to established legal practice, the inquest was tasked not with assigning guilt, but with determining how the child had died and under what circumstances. Medical evidence formed the foundation of the proceedings. The findings, presented by the attending medical examiner, addressed the condition of the body as it had been received following removal from the cellar. Observations were confined to physical facts recorded during examination. These findings were entered into the inquest record without embellishment or interpretation beyond what could be medically supported. Witness testimony followed. Statements previously given to police were summarized and reaffirmed under oath. The maid's account of household routine, the sounds heard during the night, and the events leading to the discovery were presented in sequence. Other household members provided factual accounts limited to their direct knowledge. No testimony extended beyond observation into speculation. Throughout the proceedings, the death was framed within the legal definitions applicable at the time. The coroner guided the jury through the distinction between accident, natural causes, and unlawful death, ensuring that conclusions rested strictly on evidence presented. After consideration of the medical findings and witness accounts, the inquest jury returned its verdict. The decision established that the death was not the result of natural causes and that further legal action was warranted. With that determination, the role of the inquest concluded. Its findings did not resolve the case, but they set its direction. The matter was now formally positioned to move forward within the criminal justice system. Following the conclusion of the inquest, the case advanced from inquiry to accusation. Acting on the findings placed on record, authorities moved to formally detain Celestina Sommer. The arrest was carried out without disorder, reflecting the procedural manner in which such matters were handled once a legal threshold had been met. A formal charge was then laid, alleging responsibility for the child's death. The language of the charge adhered strictly to statutory definitions, marking the point at which the case entered the criminal courts. From that moment, Summer's status changed fundamentally. She was no longer a subject of examination, but the central defendant in a capital matter. News of the arrest quickly extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. Contemporary press accounts reported the charge with measured but unmistakable interest. The contrast between Summer's prior reputation and the nature of the accusation drew attention, framing the case as one that disrupted expectations rather than confirmed them. Following her arrest, Summer was transferred into custody to await further proceedings. The move removed her from the domestic setting entirely, placing her under the supervision of the state. Access was restricted, and communication became regulated through legal channels. At this early stage, her legal position was defined but not yet argued. Counsel was arranged, and preparations began for the case to be presented before a higher court. No public defense was offered, and no explanation was advanced beyond what had already been placed on record. The transition was abrupt. In the space of days, Summer moved from private citizen to accused, her life now governed by the processes that would determine its outcome. The case reached its judicial centre when proceedings opened at the Old Bailey, the venue reserved for the most serious criminal matters in England. The trial was convened on a fixed date, recorded in court calendars and widely noted by the press, signalling the gravity of what was to be decided. Inside the courtroom, the structure was formal and unyielding. The prosecution presented its case methodically, relying on the chain of events already established through police investigation and the coroner's inquest. Medical findings were restated, witness testimony was read into the record, and attention was directed toward the circumstances surrounding the child's death and discovery. Each element was introduced in sequence, emphasizing consistency rather than conjecture. The defense responded within the same evidentiary boundaries. Arguments focused on interpretation rather than denial of recorded facts, addressing intent, responsibility, and the limitations of what could be proven beyond doubt. No attempt was made to dramatize proceedings. The case unfolded through documents, testimony, and legal framing, as was customary in trials of this kind. Throughout the hearings, the defendant's demeanor was noted but not emphasized. Observations entered the record only insofar as they were considered relevant to the court's assessment. The trial advanced without interruption, governed by procedure rather than spectacle. When closing arguments concluded, the jury withdrew to deliberate. Their consideration was measured in duration, neither prolonged nor immediate. Upon return, the verdict was delivered clearly and without qualification. The decision brought the trial phase to an end. With it, the matter shifted from determination to consequence, the legal reckoning complete, and the course ahead fixed by the judgment rendered that day. Sentencing followed the verdict without delay, carried out according to the formal rituals that governed capital cases in mid-19th century England. The court reconvened, and the proceeding shifted from examination to judgment. The transition was marked by established ceremony rather than emotion, reinforcing the finality of the court's authority. The official sentence was pronounced in clear and unequivocal terms. It reflected the gravity of the conviction and aligned with statutory penalties in force at the time. The language used was fixed, drawn from legal precedent rather than individual discretion. With its delivery, the legal process reached a decisive moment. Reaction within the courtroom was restrained. Observers later noted the absence of disruption or protest. The defendant received the sentence in silence, as required, while officials recorded the outcome for transmission to the appropriate authorities. The formality of the occasion left little room for immediate response beyond acknowledgement of the court's decision. Beyond the courtroom, The sentence prompted broader attention. Press coverage expanded, shifting from reporting on proceedings to examining the implications of the outcome. Commentaries reflected both acceptance of the verdict and unease about its severity, particularly in light of prevailing debates surrounding punishment and responsibility. It was at this stage that early discussions of commutation began to emerge. Petitions, opinions, and commentary circulated, questioning whether the sentence, though legally sound, should be carried out in full. These discussions did not challenge the verdict itself, but rather the consequence attached to it. The law had spoken. Yet the case was far from concluded. While justice had been formally delivered, its final resolution remained uncertain. Following sentencing, the case expanded beyond the courtroom and into a wider national discussion. Appeals and petitions were submitted, not to dispute the verdict itself, but to question whether the sentence should be carried out in full. These submissions drew attention to the defendant's mental condition and asked whether the law had adequately accounted for it. Medical opinions available at the time were referenced in support of these efforts. Physicians and examiners offered assessments based on observation and prevailing medical understanding, emphasizing the limits of certainty in evaluating mental state after the fact. Their conclusions were cautious, framed within the language and standards of 19th-century medicine rather than modern diagnosis. The legal standards governing insanity were central to the debate. At the time, the threshold for such a determination was narrow and strictly defined. Responsibility hinged on whether an individual was deemed capable of understanding the nature and consequences of their actions. These criteria left little room for ambiguity, and the case highlighted how rigidly they were applied. Public reaction reflected this tension. Newspapers carried commentary questioning whether existing legal definitions were sufficient, while others defended the clarity of the law as necessary for justice. The discussion extended beyond the particulars of the case, touching on broader concerns about punishment, accountability, and the role of medical opinion in legal decisions. Government review followed established channels. The matter was examined by officials within the Home Office, where petitions and reports were considered against precedent and statute. This review did not reopen the trial, but it did place the sentence under administrative scrutiny. In this way, the case ceased to be about one defendant alone. It became a focal point for unresolved questions at the intersection of law, medicine, and responsibility, questions the legal system itself was still struggling to answer. Following the conclusion of legal proceedings, Celestina Summer entered a phase of confinement defined not by public debate, but by administration and record-keeping. She was transferred between institutions as determined by official decision, each move documented through formal orders rather than explanation. These transfers reflected routine management rather than any change in legal status. During her time in custody, official reports began to note a gradual deterioration in health. Entries referenced physical weakness and declining condition, recorded in the restrained language typical of institutional documentation. There was no attempt to dramatize these changes. They appeared as observations rather than narratives, entered as part of standard monitoring. Her behavior while imprisoned was similarly described in administrative terms. Records did not indicate disruption or incident. Instead, they focused on compliance, routine, and observable condition. Any assessments made were confined to what could be documented directly, avoiding speculation about causes or intent. As time passed, the level of public attention diminished. Press coverage, once extensive, became infrequent. The case no longer occupied headlines or public discussion, replaced by newer events and concerns. What remained was the steady accumulation of paperwork, reports, logs, and official correspondence that continued long after public interest had moved on. Within the institutions themselves, Summer became one entry among many. Her name persisted in registers and files, detached from the controversy that had once surrounded it. The system functioned as designed, recording presence, condition, and movement without commentary. By this stage, the case had effectively withdrawn from public view. Forgotten by the wider public, it endured only through the documents that preserved its final chapter. The final stage of Celestina Summer's life occurred quietly and without public attention. She died while still in custody, her death recorded through the same administrative processes that had governed her imprisonment. By the time of her passing, the case that had once drawn widespread interest had largely faded from public consciousness. The official cause of death was entered into institutional records in brief, clinical terms. As with earlier documentation, the language was factual rather than interpretive, offering no commentary beyond what was required for formal record. There were no accompanying statements of significance or reflection, only confirmation that her confinement had ended in death. Burial arrangements followed standard practice for individuals who died in custody during this period. Responsibility fell to the authorities, and proceedings were conducted without public notice. The burial itself was unmarked, leaving no visible memorial or site of recognition. This absence was not unusual, but it underscored the quiet finality with which her life concluded. Final administrative entries closed the file. Registers were updated, custody records terminated, and correspondence concluded. With these steps completed, her name ceased to appear in active institutional documents. There was no ceremony to mark the end, no gathering to acknowledge the life that had passed through the legal system. What remained was a completed record, precise, impersonal, and final. In this way, a life once defined by promise and discipline concluded without distinction, preserved only in the pages of official documentation. Today, the case of Celestina Summer survives not through memory or memorial, but through documents. It exists in court transcripts, prison registers, inquest findings, and administrative correspondence, records preserved because the law required them to be kept, not because the individual at their center was meant to be remembered. Within legal history, the case is cited not for novelty, but for what it illustrates about the period. It reflects the rigidity of 19th century legal standards, particularly in matters involving responsibility, punishment, and mental capacity. The proceedings followed established rules, and the outcome aligned with the framework in place at the time. The documents confirm certain facts with clarity: the sequence of events, the verdict reached, the sentence imposed, and the manner in which the case concluded. They also leave notable gaps. Motive is never definitively established. Intent is argued but not resolved beyond legal necessity. Questions raised during public debate remain unanswered within the official record. There has been no later revision of the verdict, no posthumous reconsideration, and no formal reversal. The case stands as it was closed, unchanged by subsequent interpretation or discovery. Its authority rests entirely on what was written and accepted at the time. What endures is not a narrative shaped by hindsight, but a fixed archival trail. The language is restrained, procedural, and final. It neither condemns nor redeems. It records. The file closes. The record remains. Mabel Young. In the spring of 1875, Boston was a city in transition. The scars of the Civil War were still visible in its streets and institutions, yet the city was expanding rapidly, shaped by industrial growth, dense neighborhoods, and an increasingly organized civic life. Churches occupied a central role in this environment. Beyond worship, they functioned as schools, social anchors, and moral centers for families navigating a crowded urban world. Sunday schools, in particular, had become a fixture of middle and working-class life. They were structured, routine, and trusted, places where children were expected to be safe under supervision for several hours each week. Among these institutions was the Warren Avenue Baptist Church, a well-established congregation serving families in Boston's South End. Its classrooms, stairwells, and upper levels were familiar spaces to parishioners, maintained by staff whose presence was considered ordinary and unobtrusive. It is cases like this, quiet, documented, and largely forgotten, that continue to shape how we understand crime and justice in the 19th century. If you value carefully researched historical cases told without speculation, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps ensure stories like this continue to be examined with care. It was within this setting that Mabel H. Young, a young child from a respectable local family, spent her Sunday afternoon. Contemporary records describe her as healthy and of school age, living under the care of relatives who regularly attended church services. Nothing in the available documentation suggests her presence that day was unusual or unsupervised beyond the norms of the time. On Sunday, May 23, 1875, Mabel attended Sunday school at Warren Avenue Baptist Church. An ordinary routine in an ordinary city, moments before it became the starting point of one of Boston's most disturbing criminal cases. On Sunday afternoon, May 23, 1875, Mabel H. Young arrived at Warren Avenue Baptist Church as she had on many previous Sundays. Contemporary accounts place her arrival in the early afternoon, in time for the regularly scheduled Sunday school session. The program followed a fixed routine common to urban churches of the period, with children assigned to classrooms under adult supervision for the duration of the lesson. Records and testimony indicate that Mabel was seen entering the church building and taking part in Sunday school activities without incident. There were no reports of distress, conflict, or irregular behavior observed during the class. Responsibility for the children was shared among teachers and church staff, following the customary arrangements of the congregation. No evidence suggests that Mabel left the building during the session or was formally dismissed early. As the afternoon progressed, Sunday school concluded according to schedule. Children began to depart the classrooms and make their way out of the building, reuniting with family members or guardians waiting nearby. It was at this point, during the ordinary dispersal following class, that Mabel's absence was first noticed. Those expecting her return did not see her emerge with the other children. Initial assumptions were mild and practical, that she might still be inside, delayed, or momentarily separated. However, as the final groups left the building and Mabel did not appear, concern quietly began to replace routine expectation. Sunday school had ended. Mabel did not return home. When Mabel H. Young failed to arrive home after the conclusion of Sunday school, her absence was not immediately treated as an emergency. Delays were common, particularly in a large church where children often lingered or became temporarily separated from family members. For a short time, those responsive for her care assumed she might still be inside the building. As more time passed without any sign of her, concern increased. Family members returned to the Warren Avenue Baptist Church to determine whether Mabel had remained behind or left by another exit. By then, regular services had ended and most congregants had departed. The building, which only moments earlier had been filled with children and teachers, was growing quiet. Church staff were notified and joined in the effort to locate her. Initial steps were practical and restrained. Classrooms were checked, corridors were walked, and common areas were searched. Teachers confirmed that Mabel had been present during the lesson and that she had not been formally dismissed into anyone else's care. No one recalled seeing her leave the building. At this stage, there was no indication of violence or wrongdoing. The prevailing assumption remained that the child was still somewhere inside, perhaps delayed, confused, or momentarily overlooked. As the simplest explanations failed, the search widened. Attention shifted from the familiar rooms of the Sunday school to parts of the church not routinely accessed by children, and the effort to locate Mabel expanded beyond the immediate areas where she was last seen. As the search continued and yielded no results, concern gave way to unease. Those involved began to consider areas of the church that were not part of the Sunday school routine, spaces generally closed to children and seldom entered without purpose. Attention turned towards stairways, storage rooms, and upper levels that remained locked during regular use. One area in particular drew notice: the belfry. Access to it was restricted, and the door leading upward was normally kept secured. When those searching attempted to open it, they found it locked. Efforts were made to locate the key, but it could not be immediately produced. This complication heightened anxiety. The assumption that Mabel was simply delayed or lost within familiar rooms was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Church staff were questioned about access and keys. It was established that only certain individuals were permitted to enter the belfry and related spaces. Despite this, no one present could explain why the door was locked or why the key was unavailable at that moment. The delay caused by the missing key extended the search, while the sense of urgency continued to grow. Repeated attempts to gain entry were made. When these failed, discussion turned to more decisive action. By this point, the possibility that the child might be trapped, injured, or otherwise unable to respond could no longer be dismissed. With no key forthcoming and time continuing to pass, those present agreed that the door would have to be opened by force. Arrangements were made to break into the locked space, marking a clear shift from routine concern to alarm. When access to the belfry was finally gained, those present entered a space seldom used during ordinary church activity. The area was confined, dimly lit, and isolated from the rest of the building. It was there that Mabel H. Young was found. Her body was discovered inside the belfry area, positioned away from the main stairwell. Official descriptions recorded that she was unresponsive and bore visible injuries. The condition in which she was found made it immediately apparent that she had not simply wandered into the space or become trapped by accident. Witnesses later testified that the scene was unmistakably grave. Those who first saw her reacted with shock and distress. The search, which had begun with cautious optimism, abruptly ended in silence and alarm. No attempts were made to move her. Instead, attention turned to securing the area and summoning authorities. Word was sent for the police, and a physician was requested to attend the scene without delay. Law enforcement arrived shortly afterward, followed by medical personnel. The belfry was cleared, and access to the area was restricted. Officials conducted an initial examination, confirming that the child was seriously injured and in critical condition. Their observations were recorded, and the circumstances of the discovery were noted in detail. From this point forward, the matter ceased to be a search for a missing child. The presence of severe injuries, the location of the body in a restricted area, and the absence of any innocent explanation compelled authorities to treat the case as a suspected criminal act. The discovery in the belfry marked the moment the incident became a homicide investigation. Following her removal from the belfry, Mabel H. Young was examined by a physician summoned to the church. The examination was conducted promptly, with attention given to the visible injuries and her overall condition. Contemporary records describe her state as critical upon discovery, and medical observations were formally documented. The physician noted multiple injuries consistent with violent trauma. These included severe wounds to the head and signs of blunt force injury. The nature and extent of these injuries ruled out accidental harm. There was no indication that the injuries could have resulted from a fall or other incidental cause within the building. The findings were communicated to law enforcement and recorded as part of the official case record. Despite medical attention, Mabel's condition deteriorated rapidly. She did not regain consciousness. The physician remained in attendance as her condition worsened, and the time of death was subsequently recorded later that same day. The official determination identified the cause of death as the result of injuries sustained during the assault. This medical assessment provided the first formal, authoritative confirmation that the child had been the victim of a deliberate act of violence. The documentation of her injuries, combined with the circumstances of her discovery, established the foundational facts upon which the investigation would proceed. With her death confirmed by medical authority, the case was no longer one of suspected harm. It was now formally recorded as a fatal criminal act, requiring a full legal inquiry and prosecution. As investigators began reviewing who had access to the areas of the church beyond the Sunday school rooms, attention naturally turned to those whose duties required unrestricted movement within the building. Among them was Thomas W. Piper, the church sexton. His responsibilities included maintenance of the premises, care of the building, and access to locked or restricted spaces, including the upper levels. Witnesses confirmed that Piper had been present at the church that afternoon in the course of his regular duties. His role made his presence unremarkable, yet it also placed him among a small number of individuals who could enter secured areas without raising suspicion. Investigators noted that the belfry and its access points were ordinarily under the control of church staff rather than congregants. As inquiries progressed, several individuals described Piper's behavior during the search for Mabel. Accounts varied in detail, but consistently noted that he was observed moving about the building while others searched. Some witnesses recalled statements he made regarding locked doors and access, which were later compared against known facts about his responsibilities. Piper was questioned by authorities regarding his movements and duties that day. He provided explanations consistent with his role as sexton and denied any involvement in the child's disappearance or injuries. At this stage, no formal accusation was made. The focus remained on establishing who had access and opportunity rather than assigning guilt. Given his access privileges and proximity to the restricted area where Mabel was found, investigators determined that further questioning was necessary. Piper was taken into custody for additional examination, marking the first formal detention in the case. With Thomas W. Piper in custody, investigators began assembling the physical and testimonial records surrounding the events of May the 23rd. The focus was not on a single decisive piece of proof, but on a collection of observations, access records, and statements that could be measured against one another. Items connected to the church's restricted areas were examined, including locks, keys, and the means by which the belfry was accessed. Testimony established that entry to the upper levels required authorization and familiarity with the building. Witnesses described who was known to possess keys, who had requested access, and who had been seen moving through secured parts of the church during the afternoon. Statements given by Piper regarding his duties and movements were compared with these accounts. Investigators noted inconsistencies between certain statements and what other witnesses described, particularly concerning access to locked spaces and the timing of his presence in specific areas of the building. These discrepancies did not, on their own, establish guilt, but they raised questions that could not be resolved through explanation alone. The investigation was constrained by the limitations of forensic science in 1875. There were no modern methods for analyzing trace evidence, and conclusions relied heavily on observation, testimony, and circumstantial detail. As a result, the credibility and consistency of witness accounts carried substantial weight. As the collected evidence suggested a deliberate act rather than an accident, authorities determined that a formal inquiry was required. The investigative phase transitioned into a legal one, and arrangements were made for an inquest to examine the circumstances of Mabel Young's death under oath. An official inquest was convened shortly after the death of Mabel H. Young, marking the formal transition from investigation to judicial review. The proceedings were conducted according to Massachusetts law, with testimony taken under oath and the circumstances of the case examined in a public legal setting. Witnesses were called to describe the events of May 23rd, including the child's attendance at Sunday school, the search of the church, and the discovery of her body in the belfry. Medical testimony was presented, detailing the nature of her injuries and the physician's determination regarding cause of death. The restricted nature of the location and the absence of any accidental explanation were given particular weight. Evidence gathered during the investigation was summarized for the inquest, including testimony related to access to locked areas of the church and the movements of individuals present that afternoon. Statements previously given to police were reviewed, and inconsistencies identified during the investigation were formally noted. At the conclusion of the proceedings, the inquest reached a clear finding. The death of Mabel Young was formally determined to be a homicide caused by deliberate violence rather than accident or misadventure. Based on this conclusion, the inquest recommended that criminal charges be pursued. Following this determination, legal action moved forward. A grand jury reviewed the evidence presented, and Thomas W. Piper was formally indicted on a charge of murder, setting the case on course for trial in the Massachusetts courts. The first trial of Thomas W. Piper opened in December 1875, bringing the case into a formal courtroom setting for the first time. Prosecutors presented the evidence assembled during the investigation and inquest, relying heavily on witness testimony, access records, and the medical findings related to Mabel Young's death. The case illustrated the inherent challenges of 19th-century prosecution. Physical evidence was limited by the scientific capabilities of the era, and no conclusive forensic method existed to directly link a suspect to the injuries sustained. As a result, the prosecution's case depended on circumstantial detail: who had access to restricted areas, who was present in the building, and whether statements given by the accused aligned with established facts. Witnesses testified regarding movements within the church, the handling of keys, and observations made during the search. Defense counsel challenged the reliability of these accounts, emphasizing gaps in direct proof and pointing to alternative explanations consistent with the limited evidence available. The credibility of witnesses and the interpretation of circumstantial facts became central points of contention. After hearing the testimony and arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Despite extended consideration, they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The trial concluded without a conviction, resulting in a hung jury. With no resolution reached, the court ordered that the case be tried again, setting the stage for a second trial that would revisit the evidence under renewed scrutiny. The second trial of Thomas W. Piper commenced in January 1876, following the failure of the first jury to reach a verdict. The renewed proceedings placed the case once again before the Massachusetts courts, with heightened public attention and increased legal scrutiny. Prosecutors revisited the core evidence presented in the earlier trial, while also introducing additional testimony intended to clarify disputed points. Witnesses were recalled to address questions surrounding access to the church, the control of keys, and the movements of individuals within restricted areas on the afternoon of May 23, 1875. Testimony was presented more methodically, with emphasis placed on resolving inconsistencies identified during the first trial. Legal arguments on both sides reflected the limitations of the evidence. The prosecution argued that the accumulation of circumstantial facts, exclusive access, opportunity, and contradictions in statements formed a coherent and compelling case. The defense continued to challenge the absence of direct proof, urging the jury to consider whether reasonable doubt remained in light of the era's forensic constraints. The jury was instructed to weigh the credibility of witnesses, the consistency of testimony, and the plausibility of alternative explanations. After deliberation, they returned with a decision that the first jury had been unable to reach. A verdict was delivered. The prolonged uncertainty that had surrounded the case since the initial trial came to an end, and the legal process moved toward its final phase, bringing resolution to one of Boston's most closely watched criminal proceedings of the period. The verdict delivered at the conclusion of the second trial brought the legal uncertainty to an end. Thomas W. Piper was found guilty of murder in the first degree, in accordance with Massachusetts law as it stood in 1876. The decision reflected the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's case, based on the cumulative weight of testimony, access, and circumstance presented during the proceedings. Following the verdict, the court moved directly to sentencing. Under the statutes governing capital crimes at the time, a conviction for first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence. The presiding judge formally pronounced the penalty of death, as required by law. The sentence was entered into the official court record, completing the judicial process that had begun with the inquest months earlier. No extraordinary statements accompanied the sentencing. Court documentation records the outcome in restrained legal language, reflecting standard procedure rather than public display. With judgment entered, Piper was remanded to custody to await the execution of the sentence imposed by the court. The conclusion of the trial did not immediately close the case. Legal formalities remained, including the scheduling of execution and continued confinement of the condemned man. Public attention shifted from the courtroom to the anticipated carrying out of the sentence. With conviction and sentence recorded, the case entered its final phase. Piper now awaited execution, and the judicial process that followed Mabel Young's death moved toward its irreversible conclusion. Following the conclusion of legal proceedings, Thomas W. Piper remained in custody while the sentence imposed by the court was carried out according to Massachusetts law. Official records document that Piper was executed in 1876, bringing the case to its formal end. The method of execution was consistent with state practice at the time and was conducted under the supervision of designated authorities. The execution was recorded in standard legal and administrative terms without ceremonial detail. With the sentence fulfilled, jurisdiction over the matter ceased, and no further judicial actions were pursued. The court's role in the case concluded upon confirmation that the sentence had been carried out. Following execution, Piper was buried as recorded in official documentation. No subsequent appeals, retrials, or posthumous legal challenges appear in the historical record. The case, having passed through investigation, inquest, trial, conviction, and execution, reached definitive closure under the law. With the execution completed and burial recorded, the proceedings related to the murder of Mabel H. Young for Mally ended. What remained were court transcripts, newspaper accounts, and official summaries, documents that preserved the case beyond its immediate moment. At this point, the matter left the courts and entered the historical record, where it would be referenced not as an ongoing controversy, but as a concluded criminal case of 19th-century Boston. In the years that followed, the murder of Mabel H. Young remained present in the public record through newspaper reporting and legal documentation, rather than continued controversy. Contemporary newspapers covered the crime, the trials, and the execution in detail, preserving a chronological account that was widely circulated beyond Boston. These reports ensured that the case did not fade quickly from public memory, even after the courts had concluded their work. The proceedings were later referenced in legal histories and compilations of notable Massachusetts criminal cases. Its significance lay not in legal novelty, but in the way it illustrated the functioning of 19th-century justice, the reliance on circumstantial evidence, the central role of witness testimony, and the constraints imposed by limited forensic science. The case demonstrated how access, opportunity, and credibility were weighed in an era before modern investigative tools. Importantly, the historical record shows no later appeals, reversals, or formal challenges to the verdict. The conviction and sentence stood as entered, and the case did not re-enter the courts in subsequent years. There were no posthumous proceedings or official reconsiderations that altered its outcome. What endures, then, is not speculation or unresolved doubt, but documentation. The case survives through trial transcripts, inquest findings, and period journalism, quiet records of how a city, its institutions, and its legal system responded to a crime that briefly disrupted ordinary life. Fee before passing into history. Mary Timney, January 1862, opened quietly in the southwest of Scotland. In the rural reaches of Galloway, winter mornings were marked by routine rather than incident. Short daylight hours, frost-hardened ground, and households moving through familiar tasks shaped by the season rather than by the calendar. Near the small settlement of Carsfad, a name that appears in records with minor spelling variations, stood the home of Anne Hannah. The dwelling was modest and functional, typical of the area, shared among family members who divided labor according to necessity. Nothing in the surviving accounts suggests isolation or disorder. The household followed a pattern common to rural life: preparation of food, maintenance of the home, and readiness for work beyond the door. That morning, Hannah's brothers left the house as they ordinarily did, departing for their day's labor. Their movements were unremarkable, recorded later only because of what would follow. Hannah remained behind, continuing her routine within the house. There are no contemporary accounts describing tension, visitors, or unusual exchanges in those early hours. The day did not begin as one of note. In the broader context of Galloway at the time, this was an ordinary scene. Villages were small, neighbors familiar, and daily rhythms predictable. People came and went without remark. Doors were opened and closed without concern. The record shows no interruption to that pattern as the morning progressed. Nothing in the documentation from January 1862 suggests forewarning. The setting, the household, and the actions of that morning were consistent with countless others, quiet, practical, and unexceptional. It was a day that began as many had before it, grounded in routine rather than in expectation. If you value cases preserved through court records, testimony, and verified documents, consider liking the video and subscribing to T channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. What follows begins in rural Galloway in January of 1862. Later that same day, the quiet pattern of the household was broken. Anne Hannah's sister-in-law returned to the house in the afternoon, expecting nothing more than to resume the ordinary course of the day. What she encountered instead was immediately unsettling. The door to the house stood open. In a rural setting where doors were typically closed against the cold and left open only with purpose, the sight was unusual enough to prompt concern. Upon entering, she moved toward the kitchen, the central room of the home, and there she found Anne Hannah lying on the floor. Hannah was surrounded by a large quantity of blood. The injuries were immediately apparent and severe. Contemporary accounts describe extensive trauma to the head, leaving no doubt that something violent had occurred. There was no sign that she was alive when she was discovered. The scene did not resemble an accident or a sudden illness. The condition of the body alone made that clear. Realizing the seriousness of what she had found, Hannah's sister-in-law did not remain in the house. She went quickly to alert others nearby. Neighbors were summoned, and word spread through the small community with urgency. Assistance was sought from those close at hand, and messengers were sent to bring medical help and local authorities. What had been, only hours earlier, an unremarkable household was now the center of alarm. The discovery marked a clear rupture in the day's routine, one that would draw the attention of doctors, constables, and eventually the courts. From this moment forward, the events of January 1862 would be recorded not as ordinary life, but as part of a criminal investigation that began on a kitchen floor stained with blood. Medical practitioners were summoned to the house shortly after the discovery was reported. Their role was not investigative in the legal sense, but clinical, to determine what had occurred and whether there was any possibility that Anne Hannah's injuries had been sustained by accident or natural causes. Upon examination, The nature of the wounds was immediately clear. Hannah had suffered extensive trauma to the head. The injuries were consistent with repeated blows from a heavy object, delivered with sufficient force to cause catastrophic damage. Contemporary medical descriptions emphasized the severity of the fractures and the amount of blood loss, leaving little uncertainty about the cause of death. There was no indication of a fall, no evidence suggesting illness, and no pattern of injury that could be explained by misadventure within the home. The wounds were localized, deliberate, and violent. Based on these observations, the doctors concluded that Hannah had died as a result of blunt force trauma. This determination was made early and firmly. The injuries were assessed as fatal, and death was understood to have occurred before she was discovered. With that conclusion, the possibility of accident was dismissed, as was any suggestion of sudden natural death. What remained was the certainty that a violent act had taken place. From this point forward, the matter passed fully into official hands. The scene was no longer treated as a tragedy of circumstance, but as the location of a homicide. Medical opinion provided the foundation for the next stage of the process, transforming shock and alarm into a formal investigation governed by evidence and procedure. With the confirmation that Anne Hannah's death was the result of violence, attention turned to the immediate surroundings of the kitchen where her body had been found. The room itself offered no signs of a struggle, extending beyond its walls. There was no evidence of forced entry elsewhere in the house. What drew focus instead were several objects located in or near the kitchen area. Among them was a knife, ordinary in appearance and consistent with domestic use. A fire poker, typically kept near the hearth, was also noted. Both items were common household tools, but their presence at the scene took on significance, given the nature of Hannah's injuries. In later accounts, a wooden mallet was also referenced in connection with the scene and subsequent inquiries. At least one of these objects was observed to bear traces of blood, and in some reports, hair was noted as well. These observations were recorded carefully, but without immediate public interpretation. Authorities did not, at this stage, identify a specific weapon or suggest how the injuries had been inflicted. The focus remained on documentation rather than declaration. The objects were secured as part of the official process. Their condition, placement, and markings were noted for later examination. Nothing was removed casually, and no conclusions were announced prematurely. The emphasis was on preservation rather than inference. This marked the beginning of the evidentiary trail. What had initially been a shocking discovery was now being translated into records and physical exhibits. The kitchen, once a space of routine domestic work, became a point of reference for the investigation that followed, defined not by speculation, but by the careful cataloguing of what had been found. As the immediate examination of the scene concluded, attention began to extend beyond the Hannah household itself. In a small rural settlement, movement was limited, and familiarity was unavoidable. Investigators considered who lived nearby, who was known to come and go, and who may have had reason to enter the house without attracting notice. Among those identified was Mary Timney, a woman residing in close proximity to Anne Hannah. Timney was not a stranger to the household. Records indicate that she was known locally and had legitimate access to the Hannah home, a fact that distinguished her from unknown outsiders and made her presence less likely to draw attention on an ordinary day. As inquiries continued, Timney's movements earlier that day became a matter of interest. Witness accounts placed her in the vicinity of the Hannah house during the relevant hours. These observations were not initially framed as accusations, but they established a timeline that required clarification. In a community where routines were visible and deviations noticeable, such movements carried weight. Authorities approached Timney for questioning as part of this process. The interaction was procedural rather than confrontational. She was asked about her whereabouts, her activities, and her contact with Anne Hannah on the day of the killing. At this stage, no formal charge was made and no public conclusions were announced. The focus was shifting. The investigation was no longer confined to what had been found in the kitchen, but to who had been present, who had access, and whose account would need to be tested against the growing body of evidence. Following the initial questioning, authorities proceeded to search the living quarters associated with Mary Timney. The search was conducted as part of the formal investigation and focused on identifying any material links between Timney and the events at the Hannah household. During this process, clothing belonging to Timney was examined. Some items were reported to bear marks consistent with bloodstaining. These observations were recorded carefully, without immediate public declaration of their significance. In addition to the staining itself, investigators noted indications that certain garments may have been washed or handled in a manner suggesting an effort to remove or reduce visible traces. The condition and placement of the clothing raised further questions. Items were not found openly displayed in the ordinary course of use, but appeared to have been set aside. This was documented as part of the evidentiary record, adding to the growing body of material requiring explanation. A wooden mallet was also recovered during the search. Its relevance was noted due to the nature of Ann Hannah's injuries, which medical assessment had already established as the result of blunt force trauma. The mallet was treated as a potential instrument connected to the assault and was retained for examination alongside the other seized objects. Each item recovered during the search was catalogued and preserved according to procedure. No single discovery was presented in isolation as definitive proof. Instead, the search and seizure phase served to connect physical objects to the broader timeline already under scrutiny, narrowing the gap between the scene of the crime and the person now under investigation. With the accumulation of physical evidence and witness accounts, authorities moved to conclude the investigative phase. Mary Timney was formally taken into custody. The decision followed established procedure based on the material already gathered rather than on public speculation or inference. Timney was charged with the murder of Ann Hannah. The charge marked a decisive shift in the handling of the case. What had begun as an inquiry into an unexplained death now entered the legal record as a homicide proceeding with a named accused. Following her arrest, Timney was transferred for detention pending trial. This removal from the local setting was standard practice, intended both to secure the accused and to preserve the integrity of the forthcoming judicial process. From this point forward, her movements and communications were subject to official control. The investigative work at the Hannah household and surrounding area effectively came to an end. Physical evidence had been collected, witness statements recorded, and medical conclusions established. Responsibility for determining guilt or innocence now passed from investigators to the courts. This transition closed one phase of the case and opened another. The focus shifted away from the kitchen, where Ann Hannah had been found, and toward the courtroom, where the evidence assembled would be tested under oath. The matter was no longer one of inquiry, but of judgment, governed by legal procedure and the standards of proof required by the time. The trial of Mary Timney commenced in due course, following her detention and the completion of preliminary legal procedures. Held within the Scottish court system of the time, the proceedings were structured to examine the evidence already gathered and to determine whether it met the standard required for conviction. Contemporary records focus less on spectacle and more on the orderly presentation of facts. When brought before the court, Timney entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of murdering Ann Hannah. The plea formally established the position of the defense and set the framework for the case to be argued before a judge and jury. From that point forward, the narrative of the crime would be reconstructed not through rumor or local discussion, but through sworn testimony and documented exhibits. The prosecution's strategy, as reflected in surviving summaries, centered on physical and circumstantial evidence. Medical testimony was intended to confirm the cause of death as deliberate and violent. Objects recovered from both the Hannah household and Timney's quarters were to be presented to establish a material connection between the accused and the injuries sustained. Witnesses were expected to address Timney's movements and the access on the day of the killing. The defense position, by contrast, rested on denial of responsibility. No alternative perpetrator was formally advanced in the records, and the defense sought to challenge the interpretation of evidence rather than its existence. The emphasis was placed on questioning whether the prosecution's case proved intent and action beyond reasonable doubt. With these positions established, authority over the case passed fully from investigators to the court. What followed would be determined not by suspicion, but by how the evidence stood when examined under law. With the trial underway, the court turned to the evidence assembled during the investigation. The presentation followed a measured order, beginning with medical testimony. Physicians who had examined Ann Hannah described the injuries observed at the time of death. Their statements confirmed that Hannah had suffered extensive trauma to the head, consistent with repeated blows from a blunt instrument. The injuries were described as fatal, and the cause of death was firmly attributed to violence rather than accident or natural causes. Attention then shifted to the physical objects recovered. Clothing seized from Mary Timney was presented, with testimony noting marks consistent with blood staining. The condition of the garments and indications of washing were described factually, without interpretation beyond what could be observed. Objects recovered during the search, including a wooden mallet, were also introduced, their relevance linked to the type of injuries established by medical evidence. Witness testimony followed. Individuals who had observed Timney on the day of the killing gave accounts of her movements and presence in the area surrounding the Hannah household. These statements were used to establish a timeline, placing her in proximity to the house during the period when Hannah was believed to have been attacked. The testimony did not rely on conjecture, but on observed movements and known access. Throughout this phase of the trial, the court record reflects restraint rather than drama. Each element was presented to build a cumulative picture, allowing the jury to consider how the medical findings, physical exhibits, and witness accounts aligned. The case rested not on a single piece of evidence, but on their combined weight as set out before the court. After the close of testimony and the completion of legal arguments, the case was placed in the hands of the jury. Their task was to consider the evidence as it had been presented, the medical findings, the physical objects recovered, and the witness accounts outlining Mary Timney's movements and access on the day of the killing. The jury's deliberation was brief. When they returned to court, their decision was delivered without qualification. Timney was found guilty of the murder of Anne Hannah. Following the verdict, the court proceeded directly to sentencing. Under the law, as it stood in Scotland at the time, the crime carried a mandatory penalty. The judge pronounced a sentence of death. The ruling was recorded formally, with no deviation from established legal procedure. Accounts of the courtroom at this stage are restrained. There is no detailed record of disorder, protest, or extended address. The proceedings moved forward with the same measured tone that had characterized the trial itself. The verdict and sentence were entered into the record as matters of fact rather than spectacle. With that pronouncement, the legal process reached its conclusion. Questions of investigation and proof were replaced by the certainty of judgment. The outcome no longer rested on interpretation or possibility, but on a decision rendered under law. From this point onward, the case ceased to be about what might have occurred and became part of the formal history of Scottish criminal justice. The guilty verdict did not bring the matter to a quiet close. In the period following the trial, public attention turned toward Mary Timney herself. Sympathy for her circumstances began to circulate beyond the courtroom, reflecting a divide between the outcome of the legal process and the sentiments held by sections of the public. This response took formal shape in the form of a petition for clemency. Contemporary records indicate that approximately 3,000 people added their names in support of an appeal for mercy. The scale of the petition was notable, particularly given the rural origins of the case and the limited means by which such efforts were typically organized in the mid-19th century. Supporters advanced arguments focused not on disputing the verdict, but on questioning whether the ultimate penalty should be carried out. Some cited Timney's background and circumstances, while others expressed broader discomfort with the severity of capital punishment, especially when applied publicly. These arguments reflected concern over punishment rather than a reassessment of guilt. The petition was submitted through official channels and considered by the relevant authorities. After review, no intervention was granted. The sentence imposed by the court remained in force, and no reprieve was issued. This moment marked a clear contrast between public sentiment and legal authority. While the law had reached its conclusion through established procedure, the response that followed demonstrated unease with the consequences of that conclusion, an unease that would linger even as the case moved toward its final stage. The final stage of the case took place on the 29th of April 1862. On that morning, Mary Timney was brought to the place appointed for execution in Dumfries, in the area of Buccleuch Street, where public executions were then carried out. The execution was conducted in accordance with the law and customs of the period. It was not a private proceeding. Contemporary accounts describe a large crowd gathered to witness the event, numbering in the thousands. Such gatherings were not uncommon at the time, but the size of the assembly reflected the public attention the case had attracted since the verdict and the subsequent petition for clemency. Timney was led to the scaffold under official supervision. The process followed established procedure, with no recorded deviation or interruption. She was hanged, and death was pronounced in the customary manner. The execution was carried out without incident, and once complete, the crowd gradually dispersed. With that act, Timney's life came to an end, and the sentence imposed by the court was fulfilled. The legal process that had begun with the discovery of Anne Hannah's body in January was now concluded. What remained afterward was not further judicial action, but record. The execution entered the official history of Dumfries and of Scotland more broadly, closing the case as a matter of law, even as its significance would continue to be noted in the years that followed. In the years that followed, the case of Mary Timney took on a significance that extended beyond the circumstances of the crime itself. Her execution on the 29th of April 1862 came to be recognized as a historical turning point. Timney is widely recorded as the last woman to be publicly executed in Scotland, a distinction that fixed her case permanently within the country's legal history. Although capital punishment continued after her death, executions increasingly moved out of public view. The spectacle of the scaffold, once a routine feature of criminal justice, began to give way to private executions carried out within prison walls. This shift reflected changing attitudes toward punishment, public order, and the role of the crowd. Timney's execution stands at the threshold of that transition. In later historical records, her name appears most often in connection with this broader change rather than in detailed retellings of the crime itself. Legal histories, execution registers, and regional accounts of Dumfries reference the case as an endpoint, marking the close of an era rather than the beginning of reform. Anne Hannah's death remains documented primarily through court proceedings, while Timney's legacy is shaped by what followed her sentence. The endurance of the case lies in this convergence of individual crime and institutional change. It is remembered not only for what occurred in a rural kitchen in January 1862, but for how the response to that crime reflected a justice system on the edge of transformation. What survives of the case now exists almost entirely in record. Anne Hannah is remembered not through personal accounts or extended narrative, but through court documents, medical testimony, and the brief descriptions preserved in legal summaries. Her life appears in history largely at the point of its violent end, recorded because it entered the criminal justice system. Mary Timney is preserved in a different way. Her name endures through execution registers, legal histories, and references to the final use of public hanging for a woman in Scotland. Beyond that distinction, the record offers little elaboration. There were no later appeals, no reversals, and no subsequent legal proceedings that altered the outcome of the case. The matter concluded fully under the law in 1862. The investigation ended with conviction, the sentence was carried out, and the case was closed. Nothing in the historical record suggests unresolved legal questions or lingering judicial uncertainty. What remains is documentation. Dates, locations, verdicts, and outcomes are fixed on the page. The story persists not through rumor or reinterpretation, but through the survival of official records that mark both an individual crime and a broader moment in legal history. The files were closed. The record endured.